There are very few African American reporters reporting on the African American community.
There are people who don't want to talk to me, and they are suspicious the moment I show up in their neighborhood.
At the root of the problem is the history of race in the United States.
The perceptions that we get of ourselves and each other are shaped very early on.
Hello and welcome to our fourth and final installment of Police and the People. Today we are examining race in the media. This is the fourth in a series of roundtable conversations that we've been having about what we can do to bridge the racial divide here in Harrisburg. Not only between the police and the people, but generally in our civic discourse. And we are joined today by three tremendous guests. We have City Council Member Jeffrey Baltimore, City Communications Director Joyce Davis, and featured columnist for the Berg magazine, Paul Barker. Thank you all. This conversation in part was inspired by comments which Councilman Baltimore made from the bench, so to speak, at a city council session regarding his perception of coverage of race in the media. So, Councilman, I wanted to start with you and ask you if you'd like to expand upon those remarks.
I'll do my best, but before I get to pretty much present day stuff, I thought about it ever since getting the invitation to join this show. If we're defining media as mass communication that shapes perception, thoughts, opinions, and biases, I think we have to begin that in our school systems. I believe it starts that early. I believe that we are indoctrinated with history and social studies, American history, particularly social studies, with partiality in terms of what we receive. We're not given the full story. We're given, the virtuous nature of the founding fathers, the noble ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're never taught that 12 of our early presidents owned slaves. We're never taught that 8 of those presidents had slaves while they were in office. So I think, all throughout, from our first grade to senior high school and maybe even off into college, we are given what I would reluctantly term a whitewashed version of history. Yeah, math and science, exact things, you can't fool around with them, but you can always put a subjective spin on history. And in receiving that history at those impressionable ages, first grade, second grade, third grade, the plays that we have and the people we portray in those plays, all the way up, the perceptions that we get of ourselves and each other are shaped, I believe, very early on. We're never taught, we get Black History Month, so we're taught a few things about Black history during February, and usually they revolve around Martin Luther King, maybe Medgar Evers, maybe a few other very notable African Americans, maybe George Washington Carver. We're never told that George Washington Carver was castrated, as were many term house Negroes. Yes. That they were castrated if they were close to a daughter or a wife or females in the house. And I think when we fail to discuss the terroristic nature and the terroristic history of slavery, we leave out so much that shapes the minds of both white and black people. These are where these inferiority and superiority complexes come from, because if you don't teach those things as a basis, then you have to some way explain to yourself and to each other, how did this situation occur? How did we get poverty? Which I believe is a basis of crime. I think it's more environmental than race. How do we get to poverty? Well, we get to poverty with hundreds of years of slavery. And I think our failure to indoctrinate our kids, because of those formative years, at that point, by the time a kid gets to, or a young adult gets to be a police force or goes to a newspaper or starts writing, they've already got inherent biases, and they bring those biases to the job. We all have them, but I believe we have them because we're not taught a a true and full accounting of what this country is and was. And I don't think, every couple of months or every couple of years some major thing bubbles up and we have, racial problems and we have these discussions. But I think we're putting Band-Aids on a sore that won't heal. And you can't cover up a sore. It needs to have air. It needs to heal. And I think the discussions are always healthy. But it has to go, in my mind, a little bit beyond discussion. There has to be something concrete.
Well, let's start there. Let's start there with education, because I really appreciate you bringing that up, because a lot of the conversation that we've had has really dealt with the present and not looked at the historical roots of racism. And we could start. You mentioned the national scene. We can start with Harrisburg. John Harris, the supposed founder of Harrisburg, was a slave owner. Slavery played a role in Harrisburg's development as a city. And there is sometimes in our own local history a complete whitewashing of that fact, and more of an emphasis on the Underground Railroad or the path to emancipation. And actually, 19th century scholarship as a whole really shows that the pernicious nature of racism in Pennsylvania, in particular, was in many respects worse than was felt in parts of the Deep South. Mm-hmm. So we don't even know our own history, let alone the national history. And I do think education informs our views in ways that we don't know. And speaking to a lot of the kids today, they don't know where Ferguson is, or in relationship to New York, and how much of the founding history in that story that they're getting, I don't know. But Paul, where did you grow up, and tell us a little bit about your education, so to speak, for your job now as a reporter.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. And yeah, I actually grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. So when the Ferguson story came out, it hit a little closer to home, maybe. When I was in high school, there was the New York Times, or somebody had some big report about how we were the fourth most segregated city in the country. And that was not surprising to me or my friends. You could feel it. You could absolutely feel it. And maybe this will come up a little later, but I think you can feel it here too. In terms of education as a reporter, yeah, I came to it through kind of an unusual route. I started freelancing for the Berg maybe 2.5 years ago, maybe a little less than that, and just kind of found my way story by story in Harrisburg. I think with some of the things, Councilman Baltimore, you were bringing up, I think you're absolutely right. There's this kind of, and this sort of speaks to the statement you made at council too, there's this legacy of inequity and wrong that is just sort of still hanging there. You see its consequences in the way the neighborhoods are shaped, where wealth is, who has land, who has education, opportunity, and we're still living with it. And I think I try to bear that in mind in any story. You try to come, for the most part, we're a local magazine, so I bring a pretty localized version of it. We try not to sort of arbitrarily tie things to national issues and national stories unless it has a local impact. But you try to look for the history. What might also be going on here that is giving rise to this surface thing or controversy, that if you just take a second and take a breath and look back, is there something that better explains both sides of this, gives a better sense of how we actually got here?
And Paul, I want to give you some credit, because I think, and the Berg magazine in general, I think your format and your ability to write sort of long-form pieces allows you to investigate history and appreciate the history and set current events in a context, which maybe other aspects of the media can't do. If television is reporting like that, or maybe a different media source is trying to position controversy. You don't quite have to do that. On a personal note, can you talk a little bit about how you see yourself dealing with a racially divided city with a clear historical legacy, and how that affects your coverage as a reporter?
Yeah, sure. It's a hard thing to make concrete. I mean, I said before, I feel it, and I really do feel it. I feel that there are people who don't want to talk to me because there's a cultural and racial gulf, and they are suspicious the moment I show up in their neighborhood or knock on their door. And I understand that. I don't look at that as like, oh, why won't they talk to me? I look at that as like, yeah, I probably wouldn't talk to me either. I understand it. One of the things, that came up a lot in the past year that I was hearing a lot about, and it probably had something to do with the events in Ferguson, New York, et cetera, was I was hearing a lot of people here lamenting the fact that they felt that there was not a black-owned media. There weren't enough black reporters who were sort of local and bringing a more, I guess, balanced perspective on things. And I only had to kind of look through my pages and look around the office and go, yeah, I get it. I get it. I know where that's coming from. The flip side of that is, I like being a reporter. I'm reporting on a city that is majority African American. I want to cover stories that are relevant to everybody. So if that means that I got to be a white guy showing up, in a black neighborhood to try to get a story, I hope it's okay to think it's my prerogative to still try to do that and try to honor, whatever story is going on to the best I can. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Joyce, I want to bring you into the conversation. You have a long and distinguished career as a journalist before going into communications, and I wondered if you could give us your perspective on Harrisburg in the sort of larger media landscape context.
No, I think the problems that exist with coverage of a predominantly African-American city, Harrisburg, it's basically throughout the nation. This is a problem. Even on a higher level, at one point I stepped into NPR, and I was the Middle East editor. And we had one reporter covering the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that reporter was an Israeli. Again, how much can they report in a conflict situation on the other side? They're giving one perspective, albeit they're trying to be objective, but it's hard to be objective in that kind of situation. I would take it to Harrisburg as well. There are very few, and I'm being generous, African-American reporters reporting on the African-American community. That's a huge problem. You're not getting the story. This has been the history of our nation. When I took journalism courses and the history of journalism, one of the issues that underscored that was how the mainstream media missed reporting on the movement, the migration of African Americans from the South to the North. They missed it completely because they weren't in the neighborhoods, they didn't have the connections, they simply didn't understand the importance of the story. I would tell you that even today in Harrisburg, that is happening. The media is missing huge swaths of the story of the history of this city right now because they don't have the connections.
Could I?
Sure.
Yeah, because that made me think of something. I think that's right, and I think there are sort of two kinds of bias that I think really come in. One, which you brought up in your statement at council, was, which I think you can certainly see happen, is this sort of no holds barred, attack on a public figure. And it sometimes seems it's disproportionate or a double standard or a little more vicious on a person of color who's in a position of power, which is what you spoke to. But I also think there's a bias where it's just pure selection of stories, And I think we have a long way to go. Even our magazine has a long way to go in this regard. But we do try to seek stories out. I mean, there was my very first story for the Berg actually was on historically black churches in Harrisburg that were having structural problems, and they were old churches. There were small congregations. They didn't have the money to keep up, and it was a kind of a total fluke that I walked into that story. But that was my very first one, and it kind of set my whole perspective. That was like my first way into reporting on Harrisburg. It completely changed sort of what I looked at as the right way to cover the city. It took me into neighborhoods that are nowhere near City Hall that I would not have gone to, But it does take a deliberate effort on the part of whoever calls those shots, editor, publisher, whatever, to go seek those stories out. They're there, but you have to be willing to go down the less trodden or less obvious path, I think.
And I think you're right. I think there are a lot of different biases at work. But when you're looking at covering the city as a whole, and you're covering crime or you're covering controversy, sure you're selling papers, but I think we have to acknowledge that at the root of the problem is the history of race in the United States, suburbanization, what that has meant, how the audience for maybe the Patriot News has moved from an urban audience to a suburban audience. Well, that's based in a history of white flight from the city. And when you show stories of crime with African American faces on the nightly news, you are perpetuating those types of stereotypes. Would you agree,
I mean,
Joyce?
that's absolutely right. I mean, that's what I'm getting to. Frequently now, unfortunately, when you're covering the African American community or Allison Hill, it is to talk about poverty, it is to talk about crime. There are wonderful stories of achievement in those areas too. There are business people, there are kids who are making A's. That is not the stories that are covered because you don't have routine people who have connections and who are actually looking for the true story of the region and not just the sensational. And I think here's where we are, unfortunately, in today's media. Sensational pays the bills. And so there's no interest in that nice little story about the kid who is, overcoming odds. The interest is who got shot, who did something wrong, where's the drugs, That's, unfortunately, it's distorting the image of a people, it's distorting the image of a city.
But it's one thing to be sensational, it's another to sensationalize along fears of race. And I think that we see that especially in reporting on crime and safety within the city. I think that those fears are traded in, and that's the sensationalism that we're telling. Jeff, let's bring you back in. Can you talk a little bit about the contemporary state of the media and maybe expand on your comments there? Because I know that we've had some high-profile controversies surrounding African American leaders in the city, whether it be the treasurer's, council president's granddaughter's trial, Councilwoman Sandra Reed's arrest, you name it. There have been a whole string of those stories, and I know that you clearly had strong opinions about that coverage.
Well, relative to what Joyce just spoke about, the stories not being told, and the only stories that are told are usually crime, poverty, or a public official's misfortune. If we're not telling the everyday stories, you're helping to create that divide even more, because when you pick up a media paper or whatever, you want to see yourself in the stories. And you want to see, I think it would only foster achievement or positive images when you see yourself in a positive light. But relative to what is printed, it seems to be the only target are the bad stories. But if we were talking about the everyday good things happening in the community, it might kind of dilute those things. And I understand that reporters do have to or do kind of highlight a public official's misfortune. That may be news. But the types of things that are covered, particularly in minority public officials, are different. I mean, I could see if it were a corruption or a mismanagement, but when you delve into personal lives, that to me is a whole other level that I said in that statement. It spreads the message to me, in my opinion, that that person is just unworthy of being there, and that to me is a powerful message for black potential public servants who may think about getting into public service. And it also sends a message, I think, to the white population that says, they're not worthy. let's not support them, their opinions. They're just, you know, they're less than, and
Or
that
maybe
less
people
than.
outside Harrisburg too, right? Like, oh, look, it's a laughing stock.
Yeah.
You know, they can't run.
Who
their
is
own
driving
city.
the clown
Right.
car? Look at
Right.
look at the clowns. And
Right.
I think that is a very powerful message that seeks, and it just divides us even more.
And I don't want to personalize it too much, but I do think there's a case in point in the coverage of the African American treasurer candidates and John Campbell.
Yeah.
One of which was, clearly spectacle, and the other of which was, in my opinion, almost apologetic or attempting to be rehabilitative. And we just sort of saw that unfold, and I'm sure that was frustrating for you to see.
Now, are you talking about the sympathy? I thought it was almost like a sympathy, kind of plea to if you're talking about Mr. Campbell, let's acknowledge that he's had some problems, and let's try to help him rehabilitate himself.
That's right.
And I'm all for that, but then balance that when you're talking about
But you see, that's the key. The reporters who are reporting on one figure empathize. They see themselves. They see. If they're reporting on another, there's less of that. They are not empathizing.
Yep.
If you had more African Americans covering the leaders, they could be just as tough, but they might not see it as the other. They might see more of themselves there and might give a fairer picture of what's happening. Because I don't think we're calling on people not to be tough and
Right.
not to hold officials accountable
Right.
and not to expose when they're misbehaving.
Right.
I think we're not asking that.
Right.
But there is a difference when you really see someone as a human being or someone as something else.
Yeah.
Well, I see that, but I think that's right. But I would partly disagree, if I could, on the point about the John Campbell thing. I mean, depending on where you're getting your news, because maybe I'm not getting it in the same places. You know, in that case, the coverage I saw, it seemed pretty similar to other coverage. I mean, he was like, you know, the Patriot had a story about his initial discovery and the resignation, and then there was a subsequent story about his attempt to do a fund through his church to pay his legal costs, or
Right.
restitution. And pretty customary for that site, you know, he got ripped to shreds in the comments just like anybody else does. You know, and I think probably in about equal measure. And I'm glad
Well,
you
it's
said-
interesting
yeah.
that there's a difference in the perception,
Well, that's
because
true, that's
at
true.
least in the African American community,
Yeah.
the perception is that he got an easier ride
Right.
that may not
Well,
be
and,
true.
you know,
but
and I
it's-
will say that is
yeah.
weird that the framing of the initial story was like, look at this guy, he was a rock, you know,
a star.
right, a shining star
Star,
about
right?
that.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So I'll give you that, but
And whereas the coverage of East and Spradley was made to sort of make them look like inexplicable buffoons in some way. It was making fun of them right out of the gate as not. So it's. And a lack of we don't have to, but you
Yeah.
bring up another point, and we don't have a lot more time to discuss. And I want to get to it, which is that there is this distinction as well between the coverage and then this commentary on the
yeah.
Right.
coverage. And sometimes it's the commentary on the coverage which really reinforces racial stereotypes in ways that after you've read it, you can no longer distinguish necessarily between the commentary and the coverage, so it really all bleeds into one. Can you talk about that from a reporter's standpoint?
yeah, right. Well, you could do a lot of good for your health and blood pressure by just not reading the comments altogether, I think. But yeah, I think it's
Well, but remember the reporters, and I've spoken to reporters at Penn Live about this. They are paying very close attention to how many
That's
comments
true.
they got. They are evaluated and graded on the number of viewers and the numbers of commentators. So it's in their mind.
And it's shaping public opinion.
really
People
right,
are
people are
reading
spreading
it.
rumors in it. et
This
cetera.
is shaping the stereotypes. This is
We have taken, so the Berg does not allow comments on our website. What I always tell people who are angry about that, I say send a letter. You know, you're asking us to use our publication, which has a distribution and a readership, as a platform for your views. And you don't want to even sign your name to your views, but you want us to publicize it. I mean,
Yeah.
papers in the past, when it was just print, would not
That's
publish an anonymous inflammatory
That's right.
letter
That's
and
right.
just let their own distribution engine spread that to the world. And I think it's a real responsibility. I understand why they do it, you know. From a
Why? Tell us why.
well, maybe I don't know for sure. I suspect it has something to do with measurement of web traffic and what they term reader engagement. You know, I've heard that term thrown around a lot. But anyway, you know, I'm not to toot our own horn, but that's a very deliberate choice. You know, you don't get to use our masthead
It's a good choice.
to publicize your views.
When I was appointed to the council, a friend of mine told me, he said, Jeff, whatever, and I wasn't aware of Penn Live, he said, whatever you do not read Penn Live. And I said, okay, so for a long time I didn't read Penn Live, and then one day I just said, let me find out what's going on in Penn Live.
Right.
And there were some very vicious personal attacks on that, on people on our council, and I think people get real brave that way, and they spew venom that they otherwise might not say, and I just think it's a and I'll use the word, I think it's a cowardly way to attack people in a public forum, and I don't really believe that should be. I mean, I applaud your business for not participating in that, because I think it continues to perpetuate a divide.
And it really undermines other attempts to have a civil dialogue. I mean, this conversation, which I'm afraid we're out of time already, was about having an honest exchange of ideas, and you don't get that when it sort of descends into this sort of anonymous commentary. I will say that on our next episode of Word in the Burg, we are going to have the Patriot News come and talk about their coverage of the city in a broader way, and we'll talk about issues of why they do anonymous commentary and maybe what's the future site of the Patriot News building and some other aspects. I want to thank you all very much for coming and having a really good conversation today. I want to thank you all at home for watching. Police and the People, our final installment here, Race in the Media. I think it was an excellent discussion, and we will see you again on Channel 20.